Hi guys and welcome back to my channel. The case that I'm going to be looking into today, it's a horrific story, like many of them are, but this one is very brutal. It involves a 16-year-old girl who was, honestly, she was tortured before, she was tortured to death essentially. It's a very, very tragic case, so obviously I will warn you now that if these cases aren't for you, then please do go and try and find a different video to watch. This one occurred in October of 1985. This girl was held captive for 3 months almost, and it was known as the most terrible crime ever committed in Indiana. And I say was, it still pretty much holds up today, even after it being like half a century later, more than. So yeah, it just goes to show like what we're going to be getting into. But anyway, this case is on Sylvia Likens, and the torture, just what she endured was so horrible, and it just is very heartbreaking. This case was suggested by Mimi, so thank you for that. I appreciate any suggestions you guys have, and of course if you have any more, please do let me know. Sylvia Marie Likens was born on the 3rd of January in 1949 to parents Hugh Lester Cecile Liken and Elizabeth Frances, also known as Betty, in Lebanon in Indiana in the US. She was the third of 5 children, being born in between what is known as 2 sets of fraternal twins. We have Daniel and Diana, who were 2 years older than Sylvia. And then you have the 2 that were a year younger, which were Benny and Jenny. And Jenny, the youngest of the sort of fraternal twins and the children, she actually suffered from polio. As a result of that, one of her legs was weaker than the other, and it meant that she had this noticeable limp and had to wear a steel brace on one of her legs. Now, Sylvia's family was pretty large, and unfortunately it was also pretty poor. Lester did a lot of jobs to try and make ends meet. He would do laundry services, worked in factories. He even at one point had a restaurant, which sadly was not successful. And he also did a job where he travelled with the carnival selling food. And this was actually the work that, after trying all those different things, that he decided that he was going to go back to. He had to find somewhere or somebody to look after all of his children. Of course, there were 5 of them. You know, trying to find somebody to look after your 5 kids can be very difficult. So Diana was the eldest and had married and children, so they just had to find places for the 4 kids then. They decided to put the 2 boys, Danny and Benny, with their grandparents, which meant it just left the 2 girls, which were Sylvia and Jenny, and they had to try and find somewhere for the girls to stay. And it would only be for like a few months until they could work at the carnival, and then they would sort of come and collect them back again, and obviously they would live with them from then on. It was said that Jenny was quite a shy and insecure girl, whereas Sylvia was very much the opposite. She was very outwardly, very confident, and she was also known by the nickname Cookie as well. Sylvia was said to be quite pretty by many people, you know, that's how she was viewed, but she would often smile with her mouth closed because she actually was missing one of her front teeth. And I believe that happened when she was like 7 or 8 years old, and she would just, I don't know, playing rough with, you know, brothers and sisters like you do, play fighting, whatever, and it ended up sort of knocking her tooth out, and that is where that came from. And it was said that Sylvia was very protective of Jenny. She would also really, really look after her as well. Like, obviously she had polio and she had the limp, and she would go to the ice skating rink with Sylvia, and Sylvia would help Jenny to go out and skate on her, like on a strong foot kind of thing. She would hold her hand and she would just help her to go around and skate and have fun together. By June of 1965, Sylvia and Jenny at that moment were still living with their parents in Indianapolis. Then, on the 3rd of July, their mother actually got arrested and was sent to jail for a stint, I believe. It was for shoplifting. And this was about the time that the family was introduced to a woman called Gertrude Benizowski. She lived in this big rented house on the corner of East New York Street and Denny, and as I've already mentioned, her parents were after somebody to look after the girls. Well, Gertrude, she was also known as Gertie, which is probably how I'm going to refer to her, maybe. We'll see how this goes. So she had actually offered to take in the girls. This would enable their parents, eventually both of them, when obviously their mother Betty got out of jail, but they would both then go to the carnival and where they could work. So on the 4th of July, the children both moved into 3850 East New York Street, and Gertrude was under the sort of impression, well, they had an agreement. She was gonna get $20 a week board for the children. So she wasn't doing it for free, you know, they had agreed to pay her for it, and that was what was gonna happen. She was gonna get this weekly money. And that would be sent for Sylvia and Jenny until they came back in November to pick the girls up. And Gertrude seemed like a very trustworthy, I can't say that word, trustworthy woman, because she already had 7 children of her own. So you're thinking, well, that's a lot of kids to have in one household anyway. But, you know, you would never in a million years assume that your children would not be safe with a woman who already has 7 children of her own. That's at least my thinking anyway. So she had Paula, who was 17, she was the eldest, John, who was 12, Stephanie, who was 15, Marie, 11, Shirley, 10, and then she had 2 young boys, James and Dennis, both at 18 months. The 6 oldest children all had the last name Benzowski, and I've probably said that wrong, I'm sorry, because that was their father's name. It was Gertie's ex-husband, John Benzowski. The youngest child, Dennis, had the last name of his father, which was Dennis Wright. And Gertrude claimed that Dennis was off serving in the army in Germany. During the first couple of weeks that the girls stayed there, everything seemed fine. They were not subject to, you know, any abuse or it was very little discipline, things like that, you know. They would get on with the children, well, most of them, you know. Sylvia would sing along to pop songs with Stephanie in the rooms, and she would help out with chores around the house. She was pitching in, she was doing her bit. Both girls also regularly attended Sunday school with the family, you know, everything seemed to be going really well. But then, sadly, after the 2 weeks, one of the checks that was supposed to be received for the girls did not come in. And I actually forgot to mention as well, there was also a lot of tension with Paula, the eldest. I believe from the beginning she didn't really like Sylvia or Jenny. And that would just get worse and worse. But with regards to this check, it didn't come in, and Gertie was fuming about that. So what she did, she took the girls upstairs and she slapped them, saying, "Well, I took care of you little bitches for a week for nothing." The money order arrived the next day. So it was just a bit late, that's all. And that sadly had already set a precedent for what the girls would receive from now on. Gertie was a very frail and underweight woman, but she used to use weapons to aid her corporal punishment. So she had a big massive paddle, a fraternity style paddle, and she also had this thick leather belt, and she would use both of them as forms of discipline and eventual abuse. Because there's discipline, especially in the olden days, you know, people did get smacked with a belt or a ruler or something like that, but then there's abuse. So, you know, she went way overboard, definitely. Sylvia would do things to try and make money. So she would go out, she would collect bottles, and then she would take them into the local grocery store, I believe, where they would obviously give her a bit of money for it. So she used to do things like that. And when Gertie caught her, my gosh, she got abused for that. She got whacked with a paddle. She punished them both for that one. She then accused Sylvia of stealing some, I think it might have been chocolate, I'm not entirely sure, or sweets, something like that, which Sylvia had actually gone out and bought herself. You know, she'd purchased them, but Gertie was accusing her of stealing them, and she burned the fingertips with a lighter. And initially, the abuse was on both of the girls, but then eventually the abuse of Jenny would sort of drop off, and it would just all be focused on poor Sylvia. It's thought the reason behind that is because she was actually jealous of her physical looks and her potential at what her life could bring. And that's not confirmed, that is just what is assumed, because Gertie never admitted to any of it. Well, at least in that way anyway. So, as I said, she was quite a frail woman. Sometimes she would be too weak to discipline them, and then she would get her kids to do it, which is just mental, seriously. This is when 17-year-old Paula came in. She helped to discipline the girls. Not only that, they also invited neighbourhood children around to participate in the torture of these poor girls. Well, at this point, it was pretty much Sylvia. Jenny did still get some abuse, I believe, but like I said, it was all mainly focused on Sylvia. So the neighborhood kids would come in, they would practice judo on Sylvia, they would pay her, I believe, like 5 cents or something like that, or half a penny to be able to do so. They would kick her a lot in her genital area. They would throw her against a wall. People would have a fag and put the fags out on Sylvia's skin, so she was covered in cigarette burn scars. They would kick her, they would beat her. Just, honestly, it's horrific. On one occasion, the family were all sat down having dinner, and then I believe this boy was with them. He was called Randy Gordon Lepper, and he force-fed Sylvia a hot dog that was covered in all these condiments and spices, and you can just imagine how gross that would have been with the ketchup, the mustard, all the spices on top of it. So obviously, well, not obviously, she might not have done, but she did. She actually threw the contents up because it was just too much for her to handle, and it was gross probably. And then she was forced to eat what she had just thrown up once more. Things in the household were not great. Things at school were also not great. Stephanie was approached by a boy who propositioned her, and he said that Sylvia had actually was talking smack about her, this rumour that was going around. So Stephanie went over to Sylvia and asked her why. Apparently Sylvia admitted to this. Now I've read that she didn't start a rumour, and I've read that she also admitted to it, so I don't know which is which. But if she did admit to it, I also read that she then apologised for doing it, and Stephanie, before that, attacked her for it, but then they both ended up crying or something like that. It didn't make too much sense to me, that, to be honest. But when Stephanie's boyfriend, 15-year-old Coy Randolph Hubbard, found out about this rumour about his girlfriend, he went over to Sylvia and beat the crap out of her. He slapped her, he flipped her backwards onto the floor, and he banged her head against the wall. Then, when good old Gertie found out, she beat Sylvia with her trusty paddle. There was another occasion where Paula was beating up Sylvia, and she actually beat her up with so much force that Paula broke her own wrist. And then she went and got a cast on her wrist after she had broke it, kicking the shit out of, excuse my language, kicking the crap out of poor Sylvia. She got this cast, and then she carried on beating her. She was mainly focusing on her face and her teeth and her eye region, but she's beating her now with a cast on her arm, which are very heavy, and obviously she just felt like it was a better way to carry on abusing her. It's just, honestly, so horrific. Gertie would often not feed Sylvia, so she was suffering from malnutrition, she was weak, and then she was getting beat up. She would often accuse her of engaging in prostitution, which of course she did not do. And a lot of that is why she was getting beat in the genital area and things like that. And it will come more into play with what they did to her later on, but they would always accuse her of that. Honestly, it just sounds like, again, like I said earlier, that she was just so jealous of what Sylvia could do and how pretty she was and the potential she had. And she just, I don't know, abused her for it. She would also force, later on, Jenny to hit her own sister. And if she didn't, then she was threatened with the abuse as well. And she would actually beat her up if Jenny refused. It wasn't just a threat, she actually did it. And of course, they were both too terrified to tell anyone about it, which just honestly breaks my heart completely. You may be thinking at this point, like, why have they not told the parents? Why have they not told the school? Why? They were that frightened to tell anyone that they just didn't. They honestly thought that if they told anyone at school, the family members, literally anyone, that it would just make everything worse. So they carried on enduring it. Jenny in particular really struggled with the urge to go and tell someone, because at that point she wasn't really being abused and tortured like Sylvia was, and that was the threat. Like, you know, if she told anyone, that she would then sadly be abused like her sister and tortured. And of course that would be a massive fear to her. She's literally witnessing what her sister's going through, and she doesn't want to go for it herself, like nobody would. She's like stuck between a rock and a hard place at this point because she's so fearful of telling anyone, but she really wants to help her sister, and it's just heartbreaking. Jenny was also bullied by the girls in her neighbourhood. She would also be subjected to abuse and torment if she ever mentioned Sylvia's predicament. So, you know, it just, a lot of things were going unsaid because when they said something, they wouldn't be believed, they would be laughed at, and they would get abused for it. In July and August, both Lester and Elizabeth would come back from the carnival and they would visit their children. But I don't know why, but they didn't notice anything wrong with them. Like, if she was putting out cigarettes on her, was she putting them out not on her arms or, you know, invisible areas? Was it like on her stomach and her legs that can be covered up? I don't know, because you would have thought that they would have seen something, but they didn't. And obviously the girls didn't tell them because they were frightened to death of telling anybody. So the parents were just none the wiser. The parents thought that these girls were being well looked after, thought that they were happy, and they didn't think anything of it. So they would do this often. As soon as the carnival schedule allowed them to do it, they would come home and visit their children. The last visit was on the 5th of October. Again, on that occasion too, none of them showed any signs of any abuse or anything like that, or even visible distress. None of them looked unhappy, or at least the parents didn't notice it, if they did, kind of thing. And it's thought that this was a case they put on a pretense because Gertie was there with her kids and they were terrified. They were genuinely terrified. Almost immediately after their parents left, which would be the final time that they saw Sylvia, sadly, Gertie went to face the Likens sisters, well, mainly Sylvia, and she said to her, "What are you going to do now, Sylvia? Now they're gone." On one occasion in September, the girls were out and they actually came across their oldest sister, Diana Shoemaker, and this was at a park, I believe. Sylvia was starving at this point, you know, they fed her very little, and so Diana, she said how hungry she was, and Diana said, "Oh, like, take this sandwich." So she gave her a sandwich, and at some point, I'm not sure whether it was this occasion or whether it was another one, I'm getting a bit muddled up with the facts in my head right now, but she actually did mention the abuse that she was receiving, but Diana just thought that they were exaggerating and just didn't really think too much of it, sadly. They informed her of the actual addresses where they were staying at because she mustn't have known before that, and she said that she would come and visit them at some point. Now, when, I don't know whether they were following them or what, but some of Gertie's kids, I don't know who it was, probably Paula or Stephanie, saw that Sylvia had received this sandwich off of her sister. She went home, she told her mum, and Gertie beat her for it. And at this point, the father of a neighborhood kid called John Michael Monroe, he made an anonymous phone call to Arsenal Technical High School to say that there was a girl who had visible open sores all over her arms. Well, all over her entire body, sorry. And that she was living at Gertie's household. Now, at that point, the Likens had not attended school for a few days because, of course, they're full of sores and things like that. You know, she's not going to want to send them in school and have people asking questions, so she would just often keep them off, kind of thing. So because they hadn't attended for a while, the school sent a nurse to the home. Gertie just made up lies. She said that Sylvia had run away from the home last week, she didn't know where she was, that she was completely out of control, and that the sores that this person was referring to were because she was very unhygienic and never cleaned herself. And that's all it was. It was down to personal hygiene. That is what she claimed. And this school nurse, I guess, believed her. Just that was that. Off they went. Not a second thought about it. And as I've said, she used to invite neighborhood kids in. On one occasion, a gang of teenagers watched as Sylvia was forced to undress herself in the living room. And she was forced to insert things into her lower region. I'm not going to get into the details of it because it's just sick. But they were essentially sexually abusing her. After the beatings, quite often Sylvia was forced into a scalding hot bath to cleanse her of her sins, and they would also rub salt into her wounds as well. Sylvia had begun to lose control of her bladder. She would wet herself often at night time, and it was mainly because they kicked her and, I don't know, just kicked the crap out of her that much in that general region. She just lost the ability to control it. And every time she wet the bed, she was beaten severely for that. She would often wet herself in her sleep when she wasn't even really aware of anything, and Gertrude had decided that she was no longer fit to sleep with her children. And this physical and mental torment just carried on. The only time it really stopped was when they were watching telly. Like, they were enjoying their favourite TV shows and they took a break from it. As I said, they invited kids in and they charged them 5 cents to see the display, as it is described, of Sylvia's body. They would humiliate her, they would beat her, they would scold her, just horrific. And ultimately, they would mutilate her. At this point, Sylvia was banished to the basement because she was not fit to sleep with her own children because she kept wetting the bed. And she would often be sent down there, restrained, gagged, tied up, made to stand up. Again, she wasn't allowed to use the toilet or anything like that, so she would just go standing up because, of course, wherever the hell is she supposed to go to the toilet if you're going to tie her up and not even let her go? And, of course, that angered Gertie even more, that she felt like she was disgusting, like she'd pee herself, and it was just really vile. She would throw her into a scalding bath again to try and clean her, and then she would do it again. If you're not going to let the girl go to the toilet, then where is she supposed to go? Please tell me. On the 22nd of October, John, one of the Bazowski children, offered Sylvia a bowl of soup, and while Sylvia tried to eat that with her fingers, bearing in mind he just pulled it away, teasing her because at this point she was very malnutritioned and she was suffering from extreme malnourishment, so she was really hungry, and he's just like dangling a carrot in front of her face and then ripping it away. Gertrude did eventually allow Sylvia to sleep upstairs once more, under the condition that she, of course, did not wet herself, which, bearing in mind, she couldn't control at this point because they'd kicked the living bejesus out of her that much. And that night she was really thirsty. She whispered to Jenny to ask her to sort of slip her a drink, which Jenny did. Jenny snuck her in a drink, Sylvia drank it, and that led to her wetting the bed in the night. And as a punishment, she was forced to insert things into her lower region again, in the presence of all her children, and then she was ordered back down to the basement. Near the end, Sylvia wasn't even allowed to leave the house anymore. She was thrown down into the basement, she was locked in there, she was given little bits of crackers and things for food, and again, she was refused to be able to go to the toilet, so she would just do it all in there. Gertie then announced to all her children that Sylvia was a prostitute and that she was proud of it, and this is when she said, "We'll just put that on her stomach." So she gets this needle, she heats it up, and she begins carving into Sylvia's stomach, "I am a prostitute and proud of it." Now, Gertie was very frail and weak, and she couldn't actually finish it off, so she asked good old Richard Hobbs, a neighbourhood boy, to finish the mutilation off, which he did. Apparently, him and 10-year-old Shirley then took Sylvia back to the basement where they tried to carve into her they used an anchor bolt and they wanted to make it into the letter S, but they did it the wrong way around and ended up making it into a number 3. I mean, it's just dumb. They couldn't even get that right. Not that I'm saying that I want them to abuse her. I do not. But an S and a 3 would look very different. So yeah. Gertie then later tormented Sylvia by saying, "Now that you're branded, you'll never have a family, no one will ever want to marry you, look at the state of your body, look how ugly you are." And she would say things like, "Sylvia, what are you going to do now? You can't get married now, what are you going to do?" And then Sylvia, crying, would say, "I guess there's nothing I can do," which just honestly breaks my heart. Later that day, obviously once the carving had been done, she was forced to show it to everyone. And this is where she was forced to say that she had received it at this sex party. I don't know where she was getting it all from, but she was certainly getting it from somewhere. And then Gertie decided to force Sylvia to write a note, and this is what she did. She wrote it to basically explain everything that had been happening. She was saying in this note that a gang of boys beat her, that basically they had inscribed those horrible words on her body, that they had put out cigarettes on her and all this lot, and basically everything that Gertie had done, she was trying to sort of make it look like she was a prostitute and she'd received it at this gang sex party or something like that. I don't really know, but that's kind of what she was trying to prove, I guess, in this letter. But she'd formulated a plan. She was going to blindfold Sylvia and she was going to dump her in the nearby woods with that note. Basically going to leave her to die. Now, Sylvia actually heard Gertie's plan and she did try and escape, but sadly at this point she was very weak. You know, she was so underweight and skinny, and she was suffering from malnutrition. She just couldn't make it very far. I believe she did get out of the house. She got into into the garden, but Gertie caught up with her. She beat her again and just threw her back in that basement. She just couldn't do it. She couldn't escape. She was too far gone at that point to have the energy to muster up an escape. But she felt like she was going to die at that point, like fight or flight, I guess. She chose flight, but she just didn't make it. And one night, Sylvia actually said to her sister Jenny, which honestly really, really broke my heart. She said, "Jenny, I know you don't want me to die, but I'm going to die. I can tell it." And I just found that so sad. So, yeah. Sylvia was, like I said, she had tried to escape. Her escape plan was foiled and she was put back in the basement. Gertie tried to force feed her toast, but she wasn't able to eat that because she was really, really dehydrated at that point. So Gertie forced it into her face. She was beating her with a rod around the face to try and get her to eat it, which just, I don't know. And she literally beat her with that rod so many times that it bent into right angles because, you know, she was hitting her that many times that it actually bent the rod. Coy Hubbard then took that rod and smacked her over the head with it, which apparently knocked her unconscious. And then Gertrude once more took her down to the basement. That night, Sylvia really, really tried to alert anyone that she was there and was obviously in pain. She began screaming and banging on the walls of the basement, and some neighbours did actually hear her. She knew that it came from Gertie's household, and I don't know if it was a she or a he, so I don't even know why I'm saying that, but they knew that it was coming from the basement of Gertie's household. You know, why would anyone be screaming and smacking a wall in a basement unless they were in a terrible situation? But, you know, because it stopped at 3 a.m, they didn't think naught of it, and they didn't report it to the police to investigate because it stopped. Honestly, I don't know. By the morning of the 26th of October, Sylvia was unable to speak anymore. She wasn't able to coordinate her body parts at all, like move her arms in the way she wanted, nothing. And so because of this, Gertie moved her to the kitchen. She propped her up against a wall and tried to feed her a donut and a glass of milk. Sylvia couldn't eat that or drink that because she just couldn't do anything really, and in anger, Gertie threw her to the floor. She was then taken back down to the basement. Sylvia at this point was very delirious. She was seeing things. She kept moaning and groaning and mumbling and just was completely out of it. Paula asked her to recite the English alphabet, and she managed to do 4 letters, A, B, C, D, and that was it. She couldn't lift herself off the ground, and as a result of that, Paula threatened, like, if you don't get up, I'm going to do a long jump on you. I don't know. Sylvia had also defecated on herself, and Gertie ordered her to clean herself up, which of course she couldn't do. She couldn't even drink a glass of milk. That afternoon, several of Sylvia's tormentors all gathered in the basement, and that is when Sylvia was jerking her arms around trying to, I don't know, she was delirious, so she's pointing at people saying, "You're such a body, you're Gertie." And that's when Gertie shouted, "Shut up, you know who I am." She was then given this rotten pert. Sylvia tried to bite into it to eat. Sylvia tried to bite into it and couldn't, and she stated that she could feel the looseness of her teeth. Now, as I've already stated, she had a hole in her tooth, didn't she? So she just was totally out of it. She didn't remember that. She didn't know anything was going on. She was going on about her tooth, and this is when Jenny, her sister, said, like, "Remember, it got knocked out when we were kids," kind of thing. "Do you not remember, Sylvia?" And then apparently Jenny left to go and do some chores or something like that. In an attempt to wash her, Randy had brought this hose pipe back down to the house, round to the house. You know, Gertie told him to do it, and then John, one of her sons, ended up spraying Sylvia with it. Sylvia desperately once more tried to escape, tried to get out of the basement and get up the stairs, but she couldn't. She was just too weak to do so. Apparently, in response to that, Gertie was stood like at the bottom of the stairs, and she was just stood there staring at Sylvia for a while, and then she stamped on her head. Shortly after 5:30 p.m, Richard Hobbs returned to the household, and he goes straight down to the basement. He actually ended up slipping on the floor because it was all wet, and he found Stephanie there crying over Sylvia's, her body was a mess at that point. She was so thin, but she was sat there crying because Gertie had actually ordered her to clean Sylvia up. So the pair decided that they were going to give her a warm bath, and this time it was, well, it says warm, so I'm guessing it wasn't scalding hot. So they put her in a soapy bath, they bathed her and put her in some new clothes. They then put her on the mattress, and Sylvia muttered her final wish that her daddy was here and that Stephanie would take her home. Stephanie then turned to one of her young sisters, Shirley, I believe, and said, "Oh, she'll be alright." But she wasn't. She passed away. And when Stephanie realised that she was no longer breathing, she tried to give her CPR, tried to do mouth to mouth. And then Gertie just was shouting at the kids saying she's faking it, you know, she's faking it, she's still alive, don't believe her kind of thing. But she wasn't faking it, she was actually deceased. She was 16 years old and her body had finally given in to everything that it was enduring, the abuse, the torture, the malnutrition, the dehydration. It just couldn't take it any longer. And she finally let go, succumbing to those injuries. Sylvia Likens died on the 26th of October in 1965. Her cause of death was determined to be brain swelling, internal hemorrhaging of the brain, and shock induced by Sylvia's excessive skin damage and just the abuse that she was receiving. As I said, Gertie thought she was faking, but when she finally realised that she was not faking, that she was actually deceased, she ordered Richard Hobbs to ring the police from a payphone. He wasn't allowed to do it from the house, he had to go out from a payphone and ring the police. The police arrived at approximately 6:30 p.m. and Gertie led the officers down to Sylvia's emaciated, bludgeoned, mutilated body lying on top of this mattress, which was obviously all soiled and full of stains and things because she couldn't control her bladder. And Gertie just handed them over the letter. She claimed that she had been looking after Sylvia an hour before she died, like trying to make her, I don't know, trying to help her, trying to make her better kind of thing. Well, not better, but you know what I mean. She tried to give her first aid, she put rubbing alcohol on her wounds to try and help them, things like that. She then claimed that Sylvia had run away from home with several teenage boys, like weeks prior, I guess, that she returned home that afternoon, bare, naked, and she was clutching that note that she had written. Apparently, Paula had actually stated, this probably wasn't in the presence of the police, of course, clutching a Bible, that Sylvia's death was meant to happen, and that when she looked in Jenny's direction, she said, "If you want to live with us, Jenny, we'll treat you like our own sister." So that was obviously before the police came, and they had rehearsed Jenny on the events as to what she was going to say to the police. So that is what she said. She said that, but at the moment that she could, she whispered to the police officers, "Get me out of here and I'll tell you everything." And they did. They got her out of there and she told them everything. The autopsy of Sylvia's body revealed that she had suffered 150 separate wounds across her entire body. She was extremely emaciated at the time of her death. The wounds themselves were all over the place. They varied in nature, severity, you know, and they were also at various stages of healing. So you can tell that the abuse had been going on for, you know, a long time. She had burns, severe bruising, nerve damage, scars everywhere, muscle damage. Her genital cavity was that swollen that it was almost swollen shut. All of her fingernails were broken backwards. And most of the external layers of her, like her skin on her neck and like her chest area and on one knee, had just peeled off. And it's thought that as she was passing away, Sylvia probably had bitten through her own lips, because some sections of it were partially severed from her face, so it's thought that she bit her own lips as she was dying. And of course, she obviously suffered from extreme malnutrition. Sylvia Likens was buried at Oak Hill Cemetery in Lebanon. And of course, when everything came out, everyone went to trial, and you know, the trial actually lasted 17 days. And on the 19th of May in 1966, after 8 hours of deliberating, the jury found Gertrude Benzowski guilty of first-degree murder. They recommended a sentence of life imprisonment. Paula was found guilty of second-degree murder. Richard Hobbs, Coy Hubbard, and John Benzowski Jr. were found guilty of manslaughter. On the 25th of May, Gertrude and Paula were sentenced to life imprisonment, and the same day, Richard, Hobbs, Coy Hubbard, and John were all sentenced to 2 to 21 years to be served in the Indiana Reformatory. Now, obviously there was a lot of people involved in this case, and I've just sort of given you little highlights. I did actually find a very interesting website, which I will put up in the video. I'll put the source to it as well, because, you know, this information and all the depictions on it are not from me, so I'll put the source of it too, but I just thought I'd put it in because it goes into more detail into everyone's life after the trial and things. So like, Gertie did actually get out of prison, and then she was out for 5 years and she died of lung cancer. So I don't want to go into every individual one because this video is already pretty long, I think. I've been sat here for freaking ages, so yeah. So I'm just going to go and scroll through that so that you can read the information, because I do think it's interesting and I do think it's important, but I don't want to sit here any longer and read it all out because I could just do that. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to sort of redirect you and put that in here. Yeah.